Right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James, and today our main speaker is Professor Nana Oishi, who's joining us from Melbourne in Australia. And our moderator is Professor Adrian Favell, who's joining us from Cork in Ireland. So I'll just very briefly introduce the two of them. So Nana Oishi is Associate Professor in Japanese Studies at the University of Melbourne. She got her PhD from Harvard, where she was a Fulbright scholar. She has a lot of experience working, for instance, for the International Labour Organization in Geneva and serving on various advisory policy boards on migration and for the UN. And she has received awards, including this Prize for Modern Japanese Studies from Oxford University Press and the University of Tokyo, and has published widely, particularly on the topic of migration. And then Professor Adrian Favell is founding director of the Radical Humanities Laboratory and professor of social and political theory at University College Cork, Ireland. And he's also a visiting professor at the University of Leeds. And a lot of his work has been about the sociology of the contemporary art market. Right, so here's the timeline. That was my first 5 minutes, and I'm going to hand over now to Adrian. And the Q&A session we will run until after 1 o'clock, maybe about as long as 1:15, but I think we'll have to cut it off when we get to that point. So over to you, Adrian.
Hello. Yes, so thank you, Jason, and delighted to be here, and delighted also to be able to do something in my specialist subject with Daiwa Foundation for a while. I mean, I am principally a migration studies scholar, and I've had an engagement with Daiwa over the years in relation to my other work on contemporary art in Japan. But I have in recent years become, more involved in the study of migration and demographic issues in Japan and the broader question of Asian migrations. And so I'm really delighted to be here as a discussant and facilitator for a presentation by such a distinguished scholar as Nana Oishi from Melbourne. We'll move swiftly on to the work that she's presenting this morning. But I just want a couple of things that interest me about this subject. That firstly, as I suggest, this is her work is an important contribution to the shaping of the field of Asian migrations, I would say. I mean, there's something that's shifted very significantly in migration studies in recent years that has always been dominated by Euro-American case studies, theories, models of migration. But things have really changed very much with a significant shift in research, opening up new topics on Asian migration, but also shifting the field theoretically. And I think we met before at Waseda University, which is one of the centers for the study of Asian migrations, and places like Waseda and the National University of Singapore and Melbourne have been really important places in the development of this new field of work. And as I said, it's not just adding on new cases in migration, it's developing new theories and new ways of understanding migration. So it's a decentering of the Euro-American perspectives. A second dimension that's very interesting to me is the way in which Nana combines a study of what we might think of as typical or standard sorts of migration and immigration with more unusual, different or atypical forms of migration. And this is obvious when you start thinking about the differences between low-skilled and high-skilled migration, or when you start thinking about other kinds of professional categories of migration, temporary migrations, student migrations. All of these, in fact, shift the line of distinction between migration and mobilities. And this is at the core of my own work. I mean, migration and mobilities as a different way of thinking about migration, and particularly the governance and economic consequences, I would say, of the management of different forms of migration and mobilities are at the heart, I think, of what we learn from the new Asian migrations. And the third interest today, I'm sure, which a lot of people here will share, is an interest in the broader demographic question of migration in relation to Japan. migration. Japan is, of course, an emerging immigration nation. It's a place where new forms of immigration are taking place, where there's also a lot to be said, I think, about the distinction between migration and mobilities, new types of migration, temporary migrants, student migrants, and so forth. But as Nana is going to point out, Japan is also becoming an immigration nation. This is particularly interesting in relation to things like artists, and where one of the areas I've encountered is artists moving abroad and why they move abroad, how it happens, and what the consequences are. But the broader question of the emigration of Japanese abroad, what happens to them, and the consequences perhaps demographically on Japan of the loss of population, or the movement of population, can be brain drain, can be brain gain, but potentially depending on the dynamics. We're going to hear about, I think. So with that, I'll hand over to Nana, and looking forward to picking up the discussion afterwards.
Okay. Thank you very much, Adrienne, for very kind words, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for your kind invitation, Jason, to give a talk again to share my research. And before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I stand and pay respect to their elders, past and present, and families. This protocol in Australia before we start our talk. Okay, let me just start sharing my slides right here. Okay, please let me know if there's any issue. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much, Adrienne, for your kind words, and I'm really glad to be back at Daiwa Foundation to give a talk. I think it was 2019 when I gave a talk the last time, and then at the time I was talking about immigration reform in Japan, and then also talking about briefly on immigration issues. But today I'd like to focus specifically on the emerging immigration flow out of Japan. Okay, so let's get started. So I'd like to give an overview first. I'm going to start with a very brief immigration history of Japanese people and answer three questions. Who is emigrating and why? And what are the implications of growing immigration out of Japan? And how should the government tackle this issue? By the way, please do not cite or use any part of the slides without my consent. Please make sure to do this. Okay, so my presentation is based on three different types of data and methodologies. The first one is quantitative survey data that I collected with Professor Yusaka Horiuchi at Dartmouth College in the US. And we collected the sample of 2,415 university graduates living in Japan, mostly people who are working in Japan at the time. And these data were collected via Lancers between December 2019 and February 2020 with the funding from the Japan Economic Research Center. And the second type of data is qualitative interviews. With the help of my research assistants, I interviewed 75 Japanese nationals living in Australia and Singapore. 38 of them were skilled workers, and 32 of them were working holiday makers, like temporary migrants, and 5 key informants. And then the data were collected via snowball sampling by using a semi-structured questionnaire. And the third source is existing literature, public data, and SNS, like tweeters and so forth. Okay, so let me just start with a very historical overview. Japan has a long history as a migrant sending country and also a migrant receiving country, but I'd like to focus today on the sending side. It really started in the 7th century or 8th century when the government began to send official delegations to China. And I think many of you probably played Hyakunin issue in the past, and one of them is Abe no Nakamaro, and he's one of the very first Japanese expats and PRs, and he was living in China, and he left Japan in the 8th century as part of the official delegation to China, and he stayed there as a top government official. He tried to return to Japan several times, but his ship got wrecked. Poor guy, and he really tried to return, but he couldn't. So he ended up staying in China, and he got promoted to a very high position within the Chinese bureaucratic system. And I'm going to skip between the 9th century and the 15th century, but in the 16th century, there were huge immigration flows from Japan to Southeast Asia. Many of them were merchants and Christians and slaves. A lot of Christians particularly left Japan after Christians got prosecuted and Christianity was banned. So, for example, at one point in Manila, there was a community, Japanese community of 2,000 or more. It was a big community there at the time. And there were also communities in Macau, Bangkok, Malacca, Batavia, etc. There are quite a few Japanese living across the countries. And also Japanese slaves were trafficked to various parts of the world, including Europe. So there were some Japanese slaves working in Spain, for example. There's a very interesting book called Daikokai Jidai no Nihonjin Dore. There's a book on Japanese slaves during that time. I'm not going to go into that very much, but okay, so let's move on to the Edo period. I think many of you know that Japan went into national isolation between 1639 to 1854, but minor immigration still continued. Most of them were on the ship, and then the ship got wrecked, and then rescued by Americans, Russians, etc. But the interesting phenomena was that between 1863 to 66, a lot of people tried to, not a lot, but then a substantial number of people tried to emigrate to learn what's happening in Europe and the US. So they're undocumented migrants. So in 1863, when the country was still under Sakoku, 5 samurais were sent by Choshu domain head to the UK. And one of them was Ito Hirobumi, our first prime minister, in 1,000 yen bill. And this guy is our prime minister, first prime minister, and he was an undocumented migrant to the UK. He didn't get the permit or anything, and he smuggled himself with other people, and he moved to the UK. And 15 samurais followed from Satsuma domain, and again under the ban, basically. And very interestingly, University College London was very generous, and then they admitted them and educated them at the time, when there was no government relationship between the two countries. And most of these undocumented migrants who try to smuggle themselves to the UK and learn a lot of things from the University College London, they actually became the core members of the major government. Interesting history. So I just wanted to talk about that because, the organizer is located in the UK. All right, from 1868 to 1948, there are a lot of migrations going on, a lot more than before. Many of them, I think many of you know that a lot of Japanese immigrated to Hawaii or mainland US, particularly California and Canada. But then in 1924 and 1931, North America kind of stopped the borders. So the migration flow shifted to South America, such as Brazil, Peru, and Argentina. And particularly after the Great Kanto earthquake hit Japan in 1923, because of this destruction, unemployment rate was really high and poverty rate was really high. So the government decided to promote emigration officially in 1925. And also, I think many of you know that Japan invaded other parts of Asia, and so there was a colonial migration. A lot of people emigrated to Korea, Taiwan, and China. And by the time the war ended, 6.3 million Japanese people were living overseas. 3.2 million were civilians, and the rest were military personnel. And after the war ended, many Japanese women emigrated as war brides. After got married with American soldiers or British soldiers or Australian soldiers, etc., and they left Japan. In 1952, again, the Japanese government began to promote emigration, partly because of the, again, high poverty rate and unemployment rate. So the government created a section within Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they also created a particular agency to promote migration, which is the Overseas Migration Corporation, which is the origin body of JICA. I think many of you know JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency. So this is a regional organization of JICA. And between 1956 and 61, the immigration peaked. But then after that, because Japanese economy began to grow, poverty-driven immigration declined. And the migration flows are basically replaced by assigned expats, like Kiryo Chuzain people. And from 1980s to present, most people who emigrated from Japan were assigned expats or international students, working holiday makers, and retirees. And particularly after 2000s, more independent skilled migrant investors began to leave the country. So particularly since last year, there were a lot of Japanese TV programs talking about emigration quite a bit. That's why I was in NHK news and TV and newspapers, Japan Times. I was interviewed quite a bit because of this emigration hype in Japanese media last year and this year. So the most media discourses were focusing on low salary in Japan and salary stagnation for the last 30 years and weaker yen, and therefore more and more people feel there are more incentives to work overseas. And it is true to a certain extent what the media was reporting. Indeed, there's very little wage growth in Japan between 1990 to 2021 compared to US and Australia and other industrialized countries, including UK, I think, as well. So it is true that the wage gap between Japan and other industrialized countries got widened. That is true. But the question is it really the wage that is driving people out of Japan? That's a big question, and I'm going to get to that later on. So the overall trend is basically that we have 1.3 million Japanese nationals living overseas. 751,000 were long-term residents, and about 500,000 are permanent residents. And the gender ratio is quite clear. The flows are dominated by women. 66.2% were female. This is the overall graph between 1992 to 2022. The orange line denotes long-term residents, and the blue one denotes permanent residents. And you can see that there's a kind of big spike here in 2011. It shows the increase in the migrants, overseas migrants from Japan because of the Great East Japan earthquake and Fukushima disasters. And I think those people, after several years, they got more permanent or more stable visas and applied for permanent residency. That's why I think that there's a spike here in 2018 in terms of the increase in permanent residents. Right. And where do Japanese permanent residents live? The top countries are the following. The first one is USA, followed by Australia, Canada, Brazil, UK, Germany, Korea, France, New Zealand, and Argentina. And you can see that there's a huge increase between 2011 and 2022 in these four countries, UK, Germany, Korea, and France. I still don't know why this is the case. I wanted to actually figure out by living in the UK and interviewing people, but because of COVID, I couldn't go. And hopefully I can get to the UK and France and Germany and Korea in my next leave. All right. So why do Japanese immigrate to other countries? So a lot of scholars looked into this issue before, and so the conventional literature actually has three explanations. The first explanation is lifestyle migration. Ku and others in 2007, they did a big survey, and they across different nationalities, different migrants with different origins, and they found that 90% of Japanese migrants, and also most people from Britain, most people from other industrialized countries said that they came to Australia for better lifestyle, not a better job or more money. So they argued that the most people coming from other industrialized countries were lifestyle migrants. And Mizukami and Nagatomo, they conducted qualitative interviews with Japanese migrants in Australia, and they also confirmed this finding that they were indeed lifestyle migrants. They were seeking a better quality of life. And others who did interviews with Japanese migrants in Asian countries found that there was a gendered migration pattern, and the Japanese women were migrating to Hong Kong and Singapore because they wanted a more gender equal workplace. And also marriage migration was quite dominant as well. Hamano argued that many Japanese women migrate overseas as spouses. So those are the three sort of conventional arguments and explanations. But when I actually started looking around myself and others, and there were a lot of cases that I interviewed, a lot of cases that I observed didn't really fit into these traditional categories. So I started interviewing people and realized that the people who came to Australia before 2011 and after those people who came after 2011, there was a big difference in between. And then pre-2011 migrants were indeed pursuing quality of life, better quality of life and gender equality. There's inequality here. So gender inequality was the reason for migration. But then the people who came to Australia after 2011, after the disaster, Fukushima disaster and earthquake, were actually migrating because of the risks that Japan entailed in the future. Not necessarily, none of them was actually directly impacted by the earthquakes or the radiation. None of them was. But because after that happened, after seeing how the government reacted or how the media reacted to the Fukushima disaster and the radiation issues and other economic and geopolitical issues, they began to see that there are risks to continue living in Japan. That's why they began to leave, or they began to think about migrating, and they indeed did emigrate in the end. So there were three risks that kind of came out in their narratives very prominently. And the first one is economic risk. It was not that they were suffering from the unemployment or underemployment or anything like that. They were all very extremely successful people. Most of them were high income people. I would say like all of them were high income people. But then they were worried about shrinking market in the future or declining economic position of Japan in the world in 10 years time, 20 years time. And also they were concerned about the social security system not being sustainable in the long run by the time they retire. And also they were concerned about the geopolitical risks that Japan had. They were worried about constitutional reform, and particularly those people who had children, they were really worried about the potential military conflicts, and their children might have to go to the war, etc. And also the natural disaster risks. A lot of government agencies declare that there's a very extremely high risk that then another big earthquakes, well, actually a set of big earthquakes are expected to hit the country within 30 years, two major ones. So they were worried that there might be future risks as well of natural disaster. So so these are narratives. Considering one person said, considering the current situation of Japanese economy, if we start a war or another major earthquake hits, the blocking individuals account might happen. The government has already done it in the past at the end of World War II. The same thing might happen. So we are worried. The Japanese old age pension system will collapse sooner or later, but no solution model has been presented. So I think the individual number system was partly introduced for the government to grasp information and citizens, etc. And another person said Japan has nuclear power plants while being an earthquake country, but the government is still proceeding with the reactivation of nuclear power plants. I'm very worried about this. And another person who has child said what worried us most was the introduction of the conscription system and the possibility that our son might be taken away from us. So those concerns were there in the interviews. So, but then these interviews were still only conducted in Australia. So I really wanted to get a bigger sample to figure out what's really happening. So what I did was that I asked Professor Yusa Horiuchi to join me for collecting the data. And then we did a survey together on 2,415 university graduates in Japan. So we asked the question, would you consider long-term immigration? Try to figure out exactly how many people are trying to, how many people are thinking about emigrating. And we were surprised that it was quite high. Almost 30% of those people said, they would consider long-term migration. And among those people who lived overseas, 56% of them said, yes, we're considering long-term migration. And particularly young people who might be affected by the future military conflicts or impacted by the future pension system, unsustainability, etc., very high. And women were also high as well in terms of the immigration orientation. And what's another interesting thing was that among those who were not trusting the government and media, the immigration orientation was quite high as well. And this is a Gallup data actually, collected by Gallup survey company. And they also asked the question, ideally, if you had the opportunity, would you like to move permanently to another country? Again, Japan has a very high rate, up to 23.3% among university graduates. We didn't really actually say permanent, we just used the word long-term emigration, but the Gallup used the word permanent migration, and still 23.3% of Japanese people said yes, and which is higher, much higher than China and India. That's kind of that was surprising to me. And okay, I'm going to skip that. And the impacts of immigration orientation, the economic, in terms of the bigger sample, the economic risks were playing the major role. It's the biggest role, the 10.3%, and it was statistically significant. And quality of life also affected people's immigration orientation by 6.1%, which is statistically significant. But interestingly, environment risks such as natural disaster and radiation, it really didn't have that impact on people's immigration orientation. That was, which is kind of interesting finding. Maybe because those people who cared about environmental risk might have already left the country by the time we did the survey. Not sure. And other immigration factors do include LGBTQIA+ people's migration. We didn't actually ask this particular question, but these people's migration flows are hidden under skilled migration because there is no such thing as LGBT migration scheme, right? So the most people who wanted to emigrate out of Japan because they wanted to get better legal rights for same-sex marriage or adoption, etc., they left by using skilled migration scheme. But there are quite a few people who are emigrating under this scheme because of this because they wanted to pursue sexual equality. And also, many of them do migrate for children's education. In fact, 53% of our survey participants also said they do wanted to educate their children overseas, and 75% of them who had lived overseas in the past also said they wanted to educate their children overseas as well. So education was emerging quite prominently in our survey data as well. And different groups have different reasons for immigration, and investors and millionaires, like high net worth individuals, they are pursuing lower tax rates, right? The lower corporate tax, capital gain tax, crypto tax, income tax, etc. And so many of them do go to UAE or Malta or Singapore, etc. And many of these people do seek better investment environment and better visa package. And working holiday makers, on the other hand, they have different types of backgrounds and the orientations. And many of them, even though in the media, Japanese media, often they describe these people as, pursuing higher incomes. But when you interview people, none of them actually says they're in Australia or in other places for dekasegi, earning more money. Yes, they are not really rich people, and they are actually enjoying high wages. But that wage for them was not even the biggest priority. They really wanted to get global experience. They wanted to improve English, and they find out that the wages are high, so they love it. But then wage alone was not really the driver for the immigration. Interestingly, even among highly skilled migrants, when I was interviewing them, none of them actually said that wage was the reason. So again, quality of life and future risk that Japanese economy has, the Japanese society has, had a bigger priority, a bigger influence on their decision making. Okay, so and then even working holiday makers, after they moved to Australia, and then they really enjoyed the better lifestyle, better work-life balance, and better QOL. And many of them actually want to settle down, but unfortunately, most of them don't have enough qualifications or skill sets. Some of them do stay, but then most of them the majority of them do not. So that's the situation. And interestingly, I've seen a lot of youngsters who are trying to move around the countries. Like many of them actually do stop in Manila of the Cebu first, learn English, and coming to Sydney, Australia, Sydney, Melbourne, and then after spending 3 years in Australia, move to New Zealand, and after that they go to the UK, and after they go to Canada, etc. They move around quite a bit, enjoying that kind of relaxed life. So there are some sort of nomadic generations emerging as well. And the last category is retirees. A lot of people do pursue lower living costs and trying to maximize the purchasing power because they have smaller income, old age pensions, and so forth. And also they try to find places where good medical services or decent medical services is available, and quality of life is relatively good, with warm weather and public safety, etc. So Australia and New Zealand, and to a certain extent Canada as well. So these three countries used to be very popular during the bubble period. A lot of retirees bought their apartments or their houses, etc. But then those people disappeared after those countries changed the visa requirements and so forth. And Malaysia then became the most popular destination for retirees. But then the government changed the requirements in 2021. So it's not going to be no longer the case in the future. Most people really have to return to Japan, or very few people can afford to move to Malaysia to retire. So now a lot of people do look for a place to retire. Those people who are looking for the place to retire, they probably looking at Philippines and Thailand as well. But then even those countries, the living standards are going up, and the costs are going up as well. So to what extent Japanese retirees can afford to live in those countries is a big question mark. Okay, this is a potential net migration index provided by Gallup, and these figures show the estimates based on the surveys of the migration desires of more than 450,000 adults in 150 countries. And if all adults who desire to move in and out of the country did so, Japan's population would increase by 1%, and its youth population by 51%. But Japan is also likely to lose 8% of skilled workers. So basically, a lot of people are trying to come to Japan, but those people are not necessarily highly skilled, right? So, and more skilled migrants from Japan are willing to leave Japan and move elsewhere. So that's why there's a minus 8% of brain gain index. Whereas in the UK, the net brain index is minus 1%. Again, just like Japan, more skilled migrants are willing to, skilled people in the UK are willing to go elsewhere than the number of people who are coming into the UK. Whereas on Australia, Singapore, and the US, it's a plus. So more skilled people are willing to come into those three countries. Okay, so the need for diaspora engagement and brain circulation. So the Ganlin, the professor at the ANU now, he did the research on the diaspora policies, and then he found that the 183 countries adopt diaspora policies and to engage immigrants. And also they're trying to facilitate brain circulations by offering financial incentives for the return migration of top researchers. China is doing that. Australia was doing that to a certain extent. And also dual citizenship will facilitate return and circular migrations. So a lot of people, it's impossible to stop people from emigrating, but then if there's more engagement and more interactions between those immigrants and those people in the origin countries, they will be better for economy and for societal advancement and so forth, according to many scholars. So, and dual citizenship is definitely one of the good solutions, I think. And in fact, 146 countries allow dual citizenship, which means 75% of the world. But Japan is one of the minority countries that do not allow dual citizenship. And Singapore and Australia do have special sort of organizational unit or the institution that promotes the diaspora engagement. And India also has overseas citizens card, and that means that means an immigration status, permitting a foreign citizen of Indian origin to live and work in India indefinitely. And I think the family members are also included as well. It doesn't really give voting rights, or it doesn't give rights to acquire agricultural lands, and there are some other restrictions as well. But the people of Indian origin, foreign citizens of Indian origin, can return to India at any time and work in India, like stay in India indefinitely. So there's no other restrictions. So even though the Indian government doesn't really allow dual citizenship, this OCI status helps a lot of Indians to come back to the country and then start the businesses or work and live there, it's stuff like that. So it really helps facilitate brain circulation processes. And China also has 1,000 Talents program. I'm not going to go into that very detail, but they also have a sort of provincial government programs too, like Peacock Plan, and they offer $330,000 to new PhD graduates from top universities. One of our former students actually got this offer, and then she's now working in Shenzhen University. And in Japan, do we have any brain circulation initiatives? Actually, officially speaking, the definition of brain is different in Japan. In an international definition of brain means skilled migrants or university graduates. But the Japanese government's definition of brain is different. They only refer to researchers in natural science. So, for example, Ministry of Education's new initiative, or relatively new initiative, promoting international brain circulation only refers to scientists. And they only just promoting academic research collaborations between Japan and other parts of the world. And they don't really focus or facilitating the return or circulation of Japanese nationals living overseas. For example, and the Nobel Prize professors in Nobel Prize winners in the US, how we can retain them, we can bring them back to Japan or anything like that. There is no such thing. There is no incentive for top scholars in UK or other countries to return to Japan. There's no program like that at this point. And also, even now, the brain is defined as researchers, which I think is too narrowly defined. I think we should expand to include more skilled, other types of skilled migrants, like lawyers or medical doctors or other professions as well. Right. So growing immigration is accelerating Japan's population decline. So Japanese government needs to tackle the socioeconomic challenges if it wishes to reduce the immigration of Japanese and non-Japanese, such as gender. And in the I don't know why Wilhelm can be putting circles there, but anyway. If it wishes to reduce immigration of Japanese and non-Japanese in the dimensions of gender and sexual inequality, QOL, tax system, rigid immigration systems, and so forth, these factors actually are not just driving Japanese citizens out of Japan, but also non-Japanese people living in Japan as well. So I met some people who left Japan because of gender inequality, or they wanted to get better work-life balance, or better education systems, and so forth. So that's that. So it's not just tackling these issues. It's not just for stopping immigration of Japanese citizens only, but it will help the immigration of non-Japanese citizens living in Japan as well. And Japanese government should also develop diaspora engagement initiatives, expanding the definition more widely and of the brain more widely. And also, this is something that I'm kind of thinking about, that a lot of Japanese government agencies are aware that it is highly likely that the huge earthquakes are hitting Japan in the near future. And if that happens, the number of victims is really not comparable to the one that we had in Tohoku and Fukushima, particularly. So if it happens, I think that people like ourselves, people who are living overseas, our roles are quite important. It's going to be a very important role that we're going to play in the future. So there should be more close networks and more closer engagement between Japan and other parts of the world, like in Japanese communities in other parts of the world. And that will be probably important in the near future. And if you're a Japanese migrant living overseas and are willing to share your experience with me for my research, please let me know. Here's my email address. This is my advertisement. So let me end with that. All right. Okay. Thank you for listening. And I'll be welcoming the questions and comments from Adrian and everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Nana. And I thought what I'd do was to just a couple of initial comments. I mean, I already gave you my sort of thoughts on the framing of the subject in some ways, and then I'll try and run through three or four questions and see where we get to. I mean, this is, above all, this is a great comprehensive introduction, overview, and taking us into the study of migration from Japan, which is an area that I think is obviously understudied. Needs to be put, first of all, in a historical context, which you did for us. Needs to have clear documentation about, the kinds of numbers and types of migrants that have moved from Japan over, historically and through into the contemporary period, and that also you're doing. And I think the other obvious point about this is your focus on atypical migrations to kind of identify, we have a real problem with the study of migration, but particularly I think the political perception of migration is it's always focused on people who are identified as typical immigrants. I mean, this is often loaded with particular ethnic and racial presuppositions. It's loaded with ideas about people coming from certain socioeconomic positions. It's obviously become, in Western context, very obsessed with asylum migration and issues of security and control, all the sorts of negatives around this. And a lot of this is politically motivated, and it's diverting attention from the fact that migration happens. It happens on a large scale everywhere, and it happens largely through categories that we don't think of as migration necessarily. I mean, not typical immigration. And you show very well the diversification of the migrant types. I think particularly challenging also the perceptions of Japanese migration abroad, which were driven by ideas about expats on the one hand, corporate migrants, and on the other hand, a female-dominated marriage migration, which may have been the case more in the past, but I think has clearly changed. And you're documenting and explaining to some extent the significant changes that have happened there. So all of that, is there for everybody as a scene setter and very systematic overview. And this is very, very original, groundbreaking research. I mean, I think it's unique in its systematic and thorough nature in terms of exploring the Japanese emigration question. So I'm going to move on to what I want to do is push you a little bit theoretically and conceptually about what the significance of these trends are in a broader sense, not just the significance for Japan and policy makers, but the significance theoretically, conceptually for migration studies, because I think, like a lot of Asian migrations, as I suggested, it's shifting our standardized conceptions of migration. And I think there's ways in which it might be framed in a way that is even more clearly breaking with some of the standard conceptions about immigration, emigration, migration as such. And that's going to be my theme, I think. I mean, the first question I wanted you to comment on was my thought about the historical overview, that it very much emphasizes, I think, Japan's place in East Asia geographically, migration as part of Japan's influence and relationships with its neighbors and with the region. And it obviously has a strong colonial kind of dimension to it. I mean, Japan's historical relation through the Second World War and on into the post-war period is, it can be seen in some sense in colonial terms. And I wanted you to comment on this. I mean, to what extent, that there are parallels with European colonial legacies and the relationship of migration to them. West European colonialism, we think of it now in terms of immigration often, but in fact, it was very much about out-migration. It was all about, putting British people all over the world and running the empire through that. This is obviously what Japan did as well. And I wonder to what extent that's still reflected in the relationships to some extent, that the settlement of Japanese migrants going to Thailand, the Philippines, and whether it's related to the political economy, the ASEAN. ASEAN was initially the attempt to kind of create an integrated economic space in East Asia. Southeast Asia was very much a Japanese-led thing, kind of rivalry to China, Chinese influence. What would you comment on here in terms of post-colonial, or is it something we should see more in terms of a bit more like European EU free movement? Is this more a kind of free movement scenario where not that there is actual legal free movement of persons in East Asia, but there is nevertheless all kinds of opportunities for people to move freely in East Asia, settle abroad, retire, travel as students, travel as holidaymakers, and working and so forth. These begin to look like forms of free movement. They're not migration at all, legal technical terms. They're a kind of different sort of mobility, I would suggest. But so it's the colonial thing or the free movement thing? I mean, or does this make any sense to you? I mean, are we looking for a different kind of theoretical conception, I think, of Japanese regional relations in terms of mobility?
Okay, thank you, Adrienne, for very interesting comments. Yeah, so putting Asia.
So that's the first comment. That's the first comment. There'll be two or three more questions.
Okay. Yeah, so putting Japan in an Asian context, this is kind of challenging in a sense because for the last 10 years or so, I became a Japanese studies person instead of migration scholar. So like I really no longer do study about Asian migration as much as I used to. But even from then, with my more limited knowledge of Asia in recent years, I would say that I could be wrong. Okay, I haven't really done comprehensive research on the case of Asia versus post-colonial migration in Europe versus post-colonial migration in Asia. It's like I could be quite wrong. But my impression is that I think European countries after the World War II, they did for a certain period of time. A lot of European countries like Britain and Netherlands and so forth, they did receive people they accepted people from overseas quite a bit, right? Relatively freely until 1980s or so, like the early 80s. I forgot exactly when they stopped it, but and also the mobility was quite flexible for quite a significant number of years after the World War II, for maybe 20 years or more or so. Whereas in Japan, it was really not the case between Japan and other former colonial nations. So the people's mobilities are quite limited between Japan and former colonies, and that's I think the biggest difference between the case of Asian migration versus European and post-colonial migration in Europe. But and also that Japan was, Japanese people were quite poor after the World War ended. It was basically destroyed. Everything was destroyed basically, and people really had to immigrate to South America because of poverty and so forth. So people, and also because Japan invaded those countries in Asia, I don't think there was a huge number of people, Japanese people, who emigrated to those countries after the World War II. Yes, they began to return to countries like Philippines, or the Thailand and Korea, and not to China for a long time, and even Korea for a long time until they sort of normalized the relationship. The diplomatic relationships were not normal for a certain period of time between Japan and China, Japan and Korea. yeah, so that kind of is another differences between Europe and European countries and their post-colonial migration and destinations. Yeah, so the diplomatic relationships are different. The immigration policies are different. So those are the two major differences between Asia and Europe. In terms of the EU free movement versus sort of post-colonial migration, it's an interesting thing, but I really don't think that there is enough free movement in East Asia. It's more, migration is a lot more facilitated these days, I would say. So I agree with you that a lot more circulations of international students and working holiday makers and so forth. But because of COVID, particularly because of COVID, I think this kind of free movement type of things were not really materialized as much as the situation in Europe, I would say. I think it was very kind of becoming close to Europe up till 2019, but COVID kind of changed everything. You know, you can look at China, what's happening, what's happening there in Hong Kong. Yeah, so a lot of things changed because of COVID, I would say.
I suppose the interesting thing will be to see to what extent the possibilities of these free movement like trends within Asia get systematized in the future. So in the future, in some ways. I mean, I think to some extent they're an index of Japanese power because Japanese are free to move. But these are precisely things that I think that have been worked out eventually legally in European context. I suppose just the other thing I wanted to just mention, I'll move on to the questions from the audience, I think, as we have quite a few. It's just to what extent you don't use the concepts as such of transnationalism or mobilities in your research, even though for me a lot of what you're describing is clearly not only not a typical form of migration, so that mobilities help, I think, there, but also are quite substantially transnational. It's not about one-way migration. It's about people living in new ways, being mobile between two places, being virtually connected, and also not moving permanently. I mean, there's often a permanent sense of possible return or transnational dynamics. This is very true of artists, by the way, Japanese artists who move to Europe in large numbers. There's always a Japanese dimension to what they're doing, So just a brief comment on that maybe, and then I'll open up.
Yeah, so in terms of the terminologies, I actually do struggle with like what kind of terms I should use, because it is a public event that many of them were not scholars. I think there are definitely some scholars, but the majority of people who are attending the seminar are known scholars. So I felt like I should use more. But
maybe good. Yeah, good. Also, I suppose my point is we need to shift the public debate around away from just thinking about migration in one sort of way. And I think diversifying our ideas of who are migrants is really important. That's at the core of your work, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Thank you for that.